You're standing in the great hippodrome of Constantinople, surrounded by thousands of screaming spectators. The air tastes like copper and perfume. A woman is being dragged across the sand below, and everyone around you is cheering. But this isn't Rome. This isn't about gladiators or lions. What you're about to witness is something the Byzantine Empire never wanted you to know, a system of sexual control so elaborate, so psychologically devastating, that historians spent centuries pretending it didn't exist. The Byzantine Empire. We remember it for golden mosaics, for preserving classical knowledge, for standing as Christianity's Eastern bulwark. We speak reverently of Justinian's legal codes and Theodora's rise from actress to empress. But beneath those gilded icons and theological debates operated a machinery of sexual exploitation that would make even Rome's excesses seem almost naive by comparison. These weren't the barbaric acts of invaders or the chaos of collapse. These were calculated policies, documented in administrative records, defended by theologians, and woven so deeply into Byzantine civilization that they became invisible to those who lived within them. Before we descend into this hidden world, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? It's incredible that a story this deliberately buried can now reach people across the entire globe. If you're drawn to history's darkest corners, the truths that make us uncomfortable, consider subscribing. There's so much more we need to uncover together. Now, let's talk about what really happened in Byzantium. The year is 532 AD. The Nika riots have just been crushed with shocking brutality, 30,000 dead in the hippodrome. But Emperor Justinian and Empress Theodora are about to implement something far more enduring than massacre. They're about to formalize a system of sexual surveillance that will reach into every bedroom, every bathhouse, every corner of their empire. They called it moral purification. The records tell a different story. The documents survive. Buried in monastery archives, hidden in the footnotes of church histories, preserved accidentally because bureaucrats recorded everything, even their own atrocities. What they reveal isn't a civilization protecting virtue. It's a state that discovered something terrifying. Sexual shame is the perfect weapon for absolute control. And Byzantium wielded it with breathtaking precision. Let's begin with the children. Not the ones you're thinking of, not heirs to the throne or noble offspring. The other children. The ones Byzantium erased so thoroughly that we only know they existed because of financial records. The empire maintained state-run orphanages throughout its territories, institutions that on parchment appeared charitable, even righteous. The reality was documented by John of Ephesus, a contemporary historian who couldn't quite bring himself to write what he'd witnessed directly, so he coded it in metaphor about gardens where innocence was harvested before it could bloom. The orphanages served a specific function within Byzantium's sexual economy. Beautiful children, both boys and girls between the ages of 7 and 14, were systematically identified by officials called the Quaesitor Morum, the questioners of morals. These weren't social workers. They were talent scouts for an empire that had commodified childhood beauty. The prettiest children would disappear into the palace complex, into the households of high church officials, into spaces where no records were kept, because everyone understood what happened. There required no documentation. But here's what makes the Byzantine system uniquely horrifying. They moralized it. They created theological justifications. Church fathers wrote treatises explaining how providing comfort to powerful men prevented them from falling into worse sins, how teaching young boys the arts of the bedchamber was actually protecting young girls, how the empire's stability depended on managing the sexual needs of its elite. They transformed child exploitation into civic virtue, then wrote it into canon law. The evidence exists in the strangest places. A 7th century accounting ledger from the Great Palace lists payments to special tutors for private instruction, amounts so large they rivaled the salaries of military commanders. Another document, a letter from a provincial governor to Constantinople, casually requests 2 more of the usual type, fair-haired, for the visiting delegation. The language is so bureaucratic, so mundane, that the horror takes a moment to register. They were ordering children, like they were ordering wine. But Byzantium's sexual control extended far beyond the palace walls. The empire created an elaborate system of sexual classification that makes modern social control look primitive by comparison. Every citizen was categorized not just by wealth or birth, but by their perceived sexual utility and danger. The eunuchos, the castrated, occupied their own legal category, with rights and restrictions that varied depending on whether they'd been born that way, castrated as children, or voluntarily mutilated themselves for church careers. The process of creating eunuchs reveals the empire's chilling pragmatism. Unlike the Ottomans, who would later copy and expand this practice, Byzantium kept detailed medical records. We know exactly how they did it. Physicians, Christian physicians, trained in Hippocratic tradition, developed techniques to maximize survival rates because eunuchs were valuable. Boys between 8 and 10 years old were considered optimal. Younger, and the mortality rate was too high. Older, and they retained too much masculine development. The empire had calculated the exact age when you could destroy a child's future and still have them survive to serve. The most sought-after eunuchs weren't created domestically. They were imported from the Caucasus, particularly Georgia and Armenia, where Christian communities under Persian influence had developed the practice into a cottage industry. Parents would castrate their own sons not out of cruelty, but calculated economic desperation. A Georgian peasant family could trade one castrated son for enough gold to feed the rest for years. Byzantium had outsourced its atrocities to poverty, then profited from the supply chain. These eunuchs filled Byzantium's administration, its churches, its most intimate spaces. They were trusted precisely because they'd been robbed of what the empire considered dangerous masculinity. But here's the paradox buried in the chronicles. Many of these mutilated men rose to positions of genuine power. Narses, Justinian's greatest general, conquered Italy as a eunuch in his 70s. Ignatius, Patriarch of Constantinople, had been castrated as a child for political reasons, but became one of the Church's most influential voices. The empire had created a class of individuals who could achieve everything except the one thing that mattered most: continuation of their own bloodline. The psychological architecture of this system deserves its own category of horror. Byzantium didn't just exploit sexually, it created environments where exploitation became self-perpetuating. The most detailed account comes from a confessional document known as the Anastasis manuscript, discovered in a Mount Athos monastery in the 1890s and quickly reburied in restricted archives. It describes what happened in the palace's koiton, the sleeping quarters. Young servants, both eunuchs and intact boys, lived in a world of ritualized hierarchy where sexual submission to superiors was so normalized it had its own vocabulary, its own protocols, its own system of rewards and punishments. The manuscript describes boys competing for the privilege of serving particular officials, knowing that sexual favor led to better positions, better food, eventual freedom. The empire had gamified sexual exploitation, turning victims into participants who had to pretend their abuse was opportunity. But perhaps nothing reveals Byzantium's sexual dysfunction more clearly than its treatment of women who transgressed its impossible standards. The moicheia laws, the adultery laws, prescribed penalties that were less about punishment than theatrical destruction. A married woman caught with a lover faced public humiliation, designed with remarkable psychological sophistication. She wouldn't be killed quickly. She would be paraded through the streets with her head shaved, her nose slit, stripped to the waist while crowds pelted her with filth. But the cruelty was in what happened next. She would be placed in a convent. Not imprisoned, converted. Forced to become a nun, to spend the rest of her life praying for forgiveness for the sin of her sexuality. The Byzantine state had discovered something modern authoritarian regimes would later rediscover. Physical punishment ends. Psychological torture, wrapped in religious redemption, lasts forever. These women spent decades in convents, living reminders to every other woman of what happened when female sexuality escaped male control. The archaeological evidence supports what the chronicles hint at. Excavations of Byzantine convents reveal burial sites with remains showing systematic malnutrition and injuries consistent with self-mortification. These weren't contemplative communities. They were prisons where women were sent to slowly destroy themselves, convinced their own sexuality was demonic. The empire had weaponized guilt with surgical precision, yet Byzantium's most elaborate sexual control mechanism wasn't its orphanages or its eunuch system or its punishment of women. It was the institution of the sekreton, the secret police dedicated entirely to sexual surveillance. Operating from the reign of Justinian through the empire's final centuries, the sekreton maintained informant networks that would have impressed the Stasi. Their targets weren't political dissidents, but sexual deviants, a category that included anyone whose behavior threatened the empire's careful sexual hierarchy. The records that survive from the sekreton are fragmentary but revealing. One document lists payments to informants who reported on unnatural congress, the Byzantine euphemism for homosexual activity. The amounts varied depending on the status of the accused. Information about a baker's apprentice brought a few copper coins. Information about a senator could make an informant wealthy. The empire had created a marketplace for sexual denunciation, and people sold each other's secrets with the same casual efficiency as they sold grain. But here's where Byzantine logic twisted into something almost incomprehensible to modern minds. The same empire that hunted and punished homosexual activity also celebrated it in specific contexts. The intense emotional and physical relationships between monks were documented, praised in hagiographies, held up as examples of spiritual love. The difference? Power and consent weren't factors. The determining factor was whether the relationship served or threatened imperial control. Two monks in passionate devotion to each other were practicing holy love. Two merchants in a sexual relationship were criminals facing mutilation. The empire's sexual categories had nothing to do with the acts themselves, and everything to do with who performed them, and whether it supported or challenged the social order. Byzantium had achieved something remarkable: sexual tyranny so sophisticated it could simultaneously prohibit and sanctify the same behaviors depending entirely on context. The psychological toll of living under this system appears in unexpected places. Medical texts from Byzantine physicians describe an epidemic of what they called acedia, spiritual depression. The symptoms read like modern descriptions of trauma: inability to feel pleasure, constant anxiety, dissociation from one's own body. These physicians, writing in careful Greek, were documenting the mental health crisis created by a civilization that had made everyone's sexuality a matter of state concern. Imagine living in a world where your most intimate moments might be reported, where your private desires could destroy your family, where the wrong word to the wrong person about the wrong feelings could end with your nose slit and your body broken. That was daily reality for millions of Byzantine citizens across 1,000 years. The empire had achieved something horrifying. It had made people police their own thoughts, internalize surveillance, until the secretan barely needed to act because everyone had become their own informant. As the centuries passed and Byzantium slowly weakened, these systems didn't disappear, they evolved. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, the Ottoman conquerors found detailed records of Byzantine sexual administration and adapted them. The devshirme system that would terrorize the Balkans for centuries was built on Byzantine foundations. The Ottoman harem borrowed Byzantine organizational principles. Even the specific techniques of castration that killed 9 out of 10 boys were refined from Byzantine medical texts. Byzantium's greatest export to its conquerors wasn't art or theology. It was the architecture of sexual control. The evidence keeps emerging. In 2003, archaeologists excavating beneath a Byzantine church in Ravenna discovered a sealed chamber containing the skeletons of 17 children, all between 8 and 12 years old, all showing signs of surgical mutilation. The church had been built in 547 AD, during Justinian's reign. The remains were dated to approximately the same period. No records explain who they were or why they died, but the location directly beneath the altar suggests they weren't buried in disgrace. They were buried with honor, their mutilation and death somehow sanctified by the very institution that had destroyed them. That chamber contains the entire truth of Byzantine sexuality in one horrifying archaeological fact. Children castrated, killed, then buried beneath the holiest space in the building as though their destruction was itself an offering to God. The empire had achieved the ultimate corruption. It had made sexual exploitation not just legal or normal, but sacred. The legacy survives in ways we barely acknowledge. The Orthodox Church's obsession with sexual purity, its treatment of women's bodies as inherently corrupting, its elevation of celibacy above all other states, these aren't timeless Christian values. They're Byzantine innovations designed to support a system of control that needed sexuality to be simultaneously shameful and state-managed. When modern religious movements police sexuality with bureaucratic precision, they're following a Byzantine blueprint, whether they know it or not. The victims left almost no direct testimony. Slaves don't write memoirs. Castrated children don't publish accounts. The women in forced convents had no access to ink or parchment. What survives are the records kept by their exploiters' accounts that reveal horror through bureaucratic language, through casual mentions, through the financial calculations that treated human sexuality as a resource to be extracted and managed. The silence of the victims is itself evidence of how thoroughly Byzantium erased those it consumed. But one document breaks that silence. In the margins of a 9th-century manuscript held in the Vatican Library, someone, perhaps a scribe, perhaps a victim who'd learned to write, scratched a single sentence in Greek so faint it wasn't discovered until infrared imaging in 1978. The translation is disputed, but one version reads, "They took everything, but could not take the memory of who I was before." 17 words. Anonymous. Defiant. The only direct testimony we have from someone who survived Byzantium's machinery of sexual exploitation and chose to leave evidence they existed, that they remembered, that they remained human despite everything done to them. That sentence, barely visible, deliberately hidden, surviving 1,000 years of Byzantine glory and collapse, tells us more than all the administrative records and theological treatises combined. It tells us that beneath the golden mosaics and the philosophical debates and the claims of Christian virtue operated a system that destroyed human beings with such methodical cruelty that one survivor's greatest act of resistance was simply asserting they remembered being human. Constantinople fell. The mosaics crumbled. The theological arguments were forgotten. But that single scratched sentence survived. waiting in a margin for someone to finally look closely enough to see it. History doesn't disappear. It just hides in the margins, in the sealed chambers beneath altars, in the accounting ledgers where children were listed like inventory. And sometimes, if we're willing to look at what our civilizations really were, we find it staring back at us, asking why we pretended not to see. The Byzantine Empire lasted over 1,000 years. It preserved classical knowledge, defended Christian civilization, created art of breathtaking beauty. And it did all of that while systematically destroying the sexual humanity of millions of people who had no choice but to serve its appetites. Both things are true. Both things remain true. And the question that Scratched Sentence asks across the centuries is simple. Which truth will we remember?